world to an inner false contemplation. Man knows himself only insofar as he knows the world, and he becomes aware of himself only in it. Each new object, if looked at well, opens up in us a new way to see ourselves. End of quote. Rigorous self-examination is especially unwise and unhealthy, Goethe argues, because it is perversely unnatural and its goal of self-knowledge impossible. I quote again, "The command that man should strive to know himself is a singular demand, with which no one complies or indeed ever will comply. Man is by all his senses and efforts directed toward externals, to the world around him, and he has to know this so far and to make it so far serviceable as he requires for his own ends. Altogether, man is a darkened being. He knows not whence he comes nor whither he goes. He knows little of the world and least of all of himself." End of quote. Goethe's argument not only recalls Montaigne's image of our natural outward gaze, it also looks forward to William James's critique of self-reflection in terms of what James calls the law of parsimony in consciousness. Parsimony is another word for economy or frugality. Since we must economize our attention, the pressing demands of life will not allow us to focus long and intently on ourselves. Even if we succeed in grasping ourselves, we must immediately forget ourselves, argued James, to direct attention to ever new elements in the changing flux of experience. Nietzsche's challenge of religious and idealist notions of soul combines with his ferocious critique of the self-flagellation of Christian conscience to radically challenge the injunction of self-knowledge as psychologically unhealthy, unnatural, and indeed impossible. I quote from his essay Schopenhauer as Educator, "This digging into oneself, this straight, violent descent into the pit of one's being, is a painful and dangerous undertaking. A man who does it may easily take such hurt that no physician can heal him. What indeed does a man know about himself?" I continue from Nietzsche, this time from the essay Truth and Lies in an Extramoral Sense. What indeed does a man know about himself? And woe to the fateful curiosity which might be able for a moment to look out and down through a crevice in the chamber of consciousness and discover that man, indifferent to his own ignorance, is resting on the pitiless, the greedy, the insatiable, the murderous, as if hanging in dreams on the back of a tiger. End of quote. Here Nietzsche not only repeats the danger that intense self-consciousness brings painfully destructive and paralyzing consciousness of sin, but he also prefigures the Freudian notion of a far more vicious, unruly unconscious from which we are helpfully protected by ignorance of the self, but of which, for our ultimate healing, we are urged to know better by bringing the unconscious, at least some of its content, into consciousness. Like Goethe, Nietzsche prefers the projective activity of self-cultivation to the introspective immanence of self-examination. Hence his famous injunction to become what one is. Rejecting the very idea of a fixed essential self to be known, Nietzsche instead advocates a self that emerges through a process of perfectionist becoming. I quote, "Active, successful natures act not according to the dictum, know thyself, but as if there hovered before them the commandment, will a self, and thou shalt become a self. For the bold and willful spirit of self-cultivation, know thyself would be the recipe for destruction." End of quote. Later thinkers, as different as Wittgenstein, William James, and Michel Foucault, adapt this notion of a malleable, constructed self that is always in the making, together with a perfectionist ideal to become a different, better self. James radically dispensed with the idea of a transcendental ego in his Psychology, while defining the self as a bundle of habits and instructing how habits could be changed. his meliorist ideal of self-development advocated a strenuous mood, heroically exercising active will towards the character of progress. Wittgenstein, who volunteered for World War I through an avowed desire to turn into a different person, and whose continuous striving to improve himself is expressed in the ceaseless efforts at philosophical rethinking, which meant endless philosophical rewriting, declares, and I quote, "You must change the way you live," end of quote. Self-transformation rather than self-knowledge is Foucault's choice for the prime guiding goal of the philosophical life. I quote from Foucault, "The main interest in life and in work is to become someone else that you were not in the beginning," end of quote. As Wittgenstein acknowledges that self-examination can be painfully difficult, he writes, "The folds of my heart always want to stick together, and to open it, I must always tear them apart." So just as Wittgenstein argues that self-examination is painful, so Foucault highlights the tormenting interrogational practices inspired by the ideal of self-knowledge, privileging instead the ideal of self-cultivation as the higher end. Knowing the pain of depression, both Wittgenstein and Foucault seriously contemplated suicide. John Dewey, as I mentioned in the beginning, notes that many good words such as pity and love get spoiled when the word self is prefixed to them, since the word self infects them with a fixed introversion and isolation. Though not explicitly mentioning knowledge as getting spoiled in this way, Dewey did worry that autobiographical introspection was psychologically not good for him, just as he argued that since even the individual self is a product of social life, the kind of self and self-knowledge achieved through rich social engagement and concern for others will be superior to what narrow introspection can produce. William James, who suffered from recurrent attacks of melancholy and its related forms of physical distress, confessed to his brother Henry James that he welcomed a university teaching job because it would divert him from, quote, those introspective studies which had bred a sort of philosophical hypochondria in him, end of quote. An expert of introspective analysis, as his book Principles of Psychology makes clear, James nevertheless vigorously warned against the use of introspection in practical life, arguing the case much more explicitly than Foucault or Wittgenstein ever did. Intense self-examination, James writes, and I quote, such self-examination involves strong feelings about oneself that tend to arrest the free association of one's objective ideas and motor processes. We get the extreme example of this in the mental disease called melancholia. A melancholic patient is filled through and through with intensely painful emotion about himself. He is threatened, he is guilty, he is doomed, he is annihilated, he is lost. His mind is fixed as if in a cramp on these feelings of his own situation. And in all the books on insanity, you may read that the usual varied flow of one's thoughts has ceased, end of quote. We must, James continues, free ourselves, our thoughts, volitions, and actions from the inhibitive influence of reflection upon them, of egoistic preoccupation about the results, of the overactive conscience, and of self-consciousness. For effective original self-expression and self-development, James concludes, and I quote, trust your spontaneity and fling away all further care, end of quote. So now I'm going to pass on to contemporary psychological studies and what I think of as the need for various concepts of self-reflection. James's position seems widely supported by recent psychological literature on self-examination. Current studies which analyze this behavior under the notion of rumination not only point to its negative psychological effects, but also link it in particular to the morbidity of creative people. As the novelist William Styron notes in his personal memoir of melancholia, artistic types, especially poets, are particularly vulnerable to the disorder of melancholia, which in its graver clinical manifestation takes more than 20% of its victims by way of suicide. In linking creativity with depression, recent psychological research suggests that self-reflection is the underlying root of this connection of creativity and depression. Findings have indicated not only that negative affect leads to increased self-reflective rumination, and that inducing self-reflective rumination leads to increased negative affect, but it also shows, these empirical studies, that self-reflecting people tend to be both more creative and more prone to morbidity. Just as the causal link with depressive feelings is usually explained through the negative judgments of imperfections that rigorous self-examination typically yields, so increased creativity is explained as resulting from the fact that self-examiners take themselves more seriously than other people and thus have greater motivation for distinctive creative expression, and also because their sustained practice of reflecting on themselves develops a general greater fluency of thought, such fluency measured in quantity of new ideas within a given time span, which in turn promotes creativity. Though the arguments linking self-examination and self-knowledge with depression are empirically supported, I still would defend the value of self-reflection by suggesting that we need a more careful distinction, a more careful parsing and classification of the modes and uses of self-reflection than its detractors, but also its advocates, have provided. First, we should recognize with Socrates that any viable program of self-cultivation and self-transformation needs to start with some grasp of what one is, so as to have some sense of what one wants to change and whether or how one is changing it. To get where one wants to go, it helps to know where one is and where one starts. The first step to correcting a bad habit is to recognize what that habit actually is. If, as James argues, the self is a malleable bundle of habits, a crucial first step to self-improvement is probing the present limits of oneself so as to grasp the needed dimensions and directions of change. As Wittgenstein advocates, and I quote, "If anyone is unwilling to descend into himself because this is too painful, that person will remain superficial." End of quote. Despite his critique of self-knowledge, even Nietzsche admits a certain degree of it is implied in his ideal of self-cultivation. Recognition of your productive uniqueness, he claims, should spur you to be yourself by striving for self-cultivation toward a higher self with the aid of exemplary authors, like Schopenhauer, who inspire you toward it. Even when describing self-cultivation in terms of the deceptive fabrications and concealments of self-fashioning, Nietzsche reveals that such artful stylization of the self requires self-observation and self-knowledge. One must, he says, quoting from Nietzsche, The Gay Science, one must survey all the strengths and weaknesses of one's nature, and then fit them into an artistic plan until every one of them appears as art and reason, and even weaknesses delight the eye. Here a large mass of secondary nature has been added, there a piece of original nature has been removed, both times through long practice and daily work at it. Here the ugly that could not be removed is concealed. There it has been reinterpreted and made sublime. End of quote. If self-transformation must begin with clear, explicit recognition of what one already is, we can understand why Wittgenstein claimed a confession has to be part of your new life, for a person will be never great if he misjudges himself. Secondly, since many advocates and practitioners of self-reflection have apparently not suffered from melancholia to any significant extent, there does not seem to be a necessary link, only some statistical one, between self-reflection and depression. So we need to inquire more precisely the conditions or modes in which self-examination becomes morbidly depressing. One such condition seems to be an unrelenting, uncontrollable focus on the negative. Negative judgments, negative affects, hypochondriac fears of negative futures, and a general negativity of the meaningless of one's life. Positive dimensions and hopes here are totally eclipsed or obliterated in the obsessive gloom radiating from melancholy's scorching black sun. Negativity itself is perhaps not the most depressing aspect of melancholic self-reflection. The uncontrollable, compulsive nature of such rumination may be worse. Kant thus defines the melancholia of hypochondria, or the hypochondria of melancholia, the two terms being used interchangeably until the 19th century. He regards them both precisely in terms of, I quote, the mind's lack of power to master its pathological feelings by willfully diverting attention from its brooding about fictitious disease and imagined ills, end of quote. The core problem, then, is the weakness of mind whose will is powerless to stop us from paying attention unwillingly to mental and bodily phenomena. The inability to control one's direction of thought and stem its passive, repetitive feeding on morbidity creates in turn a very strong negative feeling of impotence that heightens one's already negative mood and passive inertia, thus making it ever harder to divert one's attention to positive thoughts and action that could remedy the situation. Contemporary psychological literature underlies this passive, uncontrollable dimension of melancholic self-reflection by defining rumination in precisely such terms of passive, uncontrollable condition. Susan Nolan Hoeksema, a leading researcher in connecting depression and rumination, and in documenting their particularly frequent and strong combination in women, defines rumination, and I quote, as passively and repetitively focusing on one's symptoms of distress, end of quote. And she argues that women are more likely to exhibit this uncontrolled excessive focus because they tend to have a more diminished sense of mastery and control than men, as well as a more limited scope for remedial action in the world. But must self-reflection be passive and uncontrollable? Aren't there forms of self-observation that instead display and encourage active, disciplined, and heightened control of mental focus? Doesn't such sharpening of mental concentration, of acuity and willpower constitute part of the traditional philosophical argument for self-examination and self-knowledge? Self-reflective meditative disciplines in both Asian and Western traditions have long justified and sustained themselves by providing their diligent practitioners with enhanced mental focus, strength of will, spiritual peace, psychic happiness, and somatic well-being, including great pleasure. Recent psychological research is also beginning to realize that self-examination or personal self-consciousness includes a wide variety of motives, styles, and foci, targets, so that self-examination should not be narrowly identified with passive, obsessive, depression-promoting rumination. One study shows a clear distinction between neurotic self-attentiveness or rumination and intellectually curious self-attentiveness or reflection. If the former seems clearly linked to depression and motivations of fear and anxiety, the latter is instead essentially motivated by active positive curiosity that is not significantly correlated with bad feelings, but instead is linked to self-control and conscientiousness that imply willpower and mental mastery. Other recent studies in experimental psychology and neurophysiology have demonstrated that meditation training, including disciplines of meditative self-examination, can effectively reduce symptoms of anxiety, depression, and panic, thus generating more positive affect in the meditating subjects. Further experiments have established the neurological basis of this positive power. Having determined that positive feelings and a resilient affective style are associated with high levels of left prefrontal activation in the brain and with high levels of antibody titers to influenza vaccine, scientists have shown that subjects who were introduced to an 8-week meditation training program display not only significantly higher levels of left-sided anterior brain activation than the control group of non-meditators, but those meditating subjects also showed significant increases in antibody titers. The results clearly suggest that meditation improves not only our mood, but also our immune function. Identifying the obsessive excessive feature of rumination as key to its morbidity should help us recognize that condemnations of self-knowledge as detrimental to mental health too often wrongly assimilate such knowledge with relentless, disproportionate overuse of self-conscious self-examination. Too much of any good thing can be bad, and that is also the case for self-reflection, whose value depends on using it in the appropriate circumstances and in the appropriate measure. Though many philosophers, including William James and Merleau-Ponty, have argued that motor actions and speech are impeded if we pay explicit attention to precisely how we are performing them, somatic educational studies have shown the need for a certain measure of disciplined self-examination of our bodily self-use, not only for learning a new form of behavior, but especially for improving an established habit of action. Here we should recall that alongside know thyself, Apollo's Delphic temple inscribed a second maxim, which was nothing too much, as if to insist on the need for appropriate moderation in applying the first maxim, know thyself. The next section now is about specifically somatic self-consciousness. Besides different styles, motives, quantities, contexts, and levels of self-control in self-examining consciousness, there are also different foci or targets to distinguish. One useful distinction is that between attending to one's own experience in contrasting to thinking about how one appears to others, whether in terms of bodily appearance, character, social status, or overall identity. And within one's own experience, some might wish to distinguish examining one's mind, character, or soul from examining one's somatic feelings. Recall how Kant and the Neoplatonists contrasted the uplifting